To introduce our guest today, I will introduce to you poet laureate of West Virginia, Mark Harshman.
Good afternoon. It's a real treat to be here to welcome Meredith Sue Willis to Wheeling today. In case I do forget, later next Tuesday's Wheeling Poetry Series, George Bilgair is really an exceptionally special treat for us to have. He's been described by the Cleveland Plain Dealer, mind you, he lives in Cleveland, but as one of America's greatest living poets, and I think it's quite true. Many of you may see his work on a regular basis in the Writer's Almanac. But today is Sue's Day. Meredith Sue Willis's 22nd book, her novel, Their Houses, was published this past fall by West Virginia University Press, and the inimitable Philip Lopate called it sharp, tough-minded, and compelling. Myself, I'd say the same can be said for every one of her books. She is a marvelous writer. A native of Shinston, West Virginia, Meredith Sue is quite simply one of America's finest writers of fiction, both short and long fiction forms, as well as for both adults and young people. She is currently an adjunct assistant professor of creative writing at New York University, School of Professional Studies. Her books have been published by such venerable national presses as Scribner's and HarperCollins, as well as distinguished university presses such as our own WVU Press and Ohio University Press, and many, many others. She was also a part of the groundbreaking Teachers and Writers Collaborative in New York City, the repercussions of whose work were felt throughout the nation as it defined, among many other things, what we now call Artists in the Schools programs. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude from Barnard and holds an MFA from Columbia University, where she studied with no less than Anthony Burgess and Laurie Siegel. About her involvement in the protest movements of the late 60s alone, we might talk for hours, but I should let that be Sue's call. I'll just add that I've never read a book of Sue's that did not move me, whose prose didn't convince me with its dependably tender honesty, whose portrayals of character and place are as perfect as anything I've ever read from our region or anywhere beyond. And from whom else could I get such great lines as these from Blair Morgan to her New York City friend in her novel Trespassers? Quote, I suffer too, but you probably wouldn't recognize Appalachian suffering because it's subtle. Give a not so subtle welcome, please, to Meredith Sue Willis.
I was asking him if I could have a copy of that. It was really nice to meet you. This is actually my second time visiting Lunch with Books, which I think is just a wonderful, wonderful institution, and we're all really lucky to have it. What I'm going to do today, in the time we have, is I'm going to read for maybe 20 minutes pieces of this novel, Their Houses, and then I'm going to open it, to questions or comments. I have a few remarks I want to make, though, about what I consider is the use of fiction. I'm particularly interested in novels and short stories, but I actually think they have an ethical function in our lives, and I'm going to talk a little about that in the course of our discussion after I read. The reading is going to be first a very small section from the first chapter of the novel, in which three of the main characters are children. And if you read the whole chapter, which I'm not going to read to you, it kind of sets up the characters, it sets up what will be behind the plot of the novel. And after I've read that little part about the children, I will then read most of the chapter about the husband of one of the characters, who was involved in some things in West Virginia in the 1990s that you may recognize from the newspapers when I get there. But let me begin with a little bit from the first chapter. It's kind of setting up what it's about. When he was small, Richie carried quarters and candy bars for the big boys. They would stop shoving him long enough to stare in wonderment, take the candy and coins, then go back to pushing him or maybe pulling his pants down to see if he was a boy, or equally likely, ignoring him. Being ignored was the worst. As a child, he always preferred battery to loneliness. His mother bought him expensive clothes, not appreciated by the other kids. When his glasses got broken and his knees bruised, she sent him to private boarding schools as if there were no bullies in private boarding schools. His mother never learned the money lesson, and it has limits. She married his father when he was already sick, and Richie had been born in the first year of their marriage. They all knew that she was waiting for his father to die so they could live with his money, but without him. Richie felt that he and his mother had both been pathetic in their dependence on money. She used money to buy friends, and he used it to placate the neighborhood boys. Thus, when he was treated kindly by Dinah and Grace for absolutely no reason, it was one of the great mysteries of the universe. 35 years later, he still didn't believe in altruism, but he did believe in Dinah and how she had refused his quarters and only accepted one candy bar for herself and one for Grace. The way it worked when they were small was that Richie played with Grace while Dinah gave instructions. Usually they started with action figures and dolls, sometimes board games, sometimes digging holes in the garden or making forts. The garden was a logwood, which was Richie's father's property. Sometimes they played in the logwood carriage house where the girls lived. From time to time, quietly, they played in the big house. In the big house, they always went to the train rooms, which were next door to his father's bedroom and dressing room. The trains were the only pleasant thing he ever associated with his father. Richie understood better now how being ill could make you resentful, irritable, and full of rage, but it didn't mitigate his hatred for his father. His father loved trains as a boy and insisted that Richie loved them too. What Richie liked was turning on the power and the spotlights and the engines whirring and running through 2 whole rooms, everything in Richie's power, the villages with lights, the train bridges, the signal arms that went up and down, the hooting engines. After his father died, he had parties, and his mother had parties, and she redecorated, and he liquidated the trains for capital to invest in pills and marijuana that he sold at school. But back when he was 7 and 8 and 9, the best thing in his life was to have Dinah and Grace in the train rooms. Dinah liked saving the toy people from disasters. Grace and Richie liked making the disasters, train wrecks and volcanoes and tornadoes and tidal waves. Dinah would say, okay, the volcano finished erupting, now it's time to save the people. Grace would lay out the wounded in rows. This one burnt to a crisp, she would say, but this one is only half burnt. This one is dead, and this one is alive. Richie ran around the train tables, moving things and making explosion noises. He could still feel that incredible freedom, the explosions low in his throat, rumbling through each body. Every once in a while, he would stop and stare at the sisters for a long time. He remembered every detail of them. Grace had a small white face and a lot of thick brown hair. Dinah had dark honey-colored hair, just a little darker than her skin. Okay, Richie, Dinah would say, your job is to set up the hospital train that has to bring all the wounded people over the mountain for me to fix up. Can we have a funeral for the dead ones? Said Grace. No, said Dinah, none of them died. Yes, they did, said Grace. They really did die. My father is going to be dead soon, Richie said. We're going to have the biggest funeral in the world and limousines for everyone, and you're invited. No, said Dinah, no funerals. Some of them are hurt very badly, but no one is going to die. Sometimes, though, she did let them have a funeral, a dump car full of plastic bodies and a burial in one of the train tunnels. And then, miraculously, just as they were thrusting them deep into the tunnel, into the mountain, Dinah would declare them alive again. Grace struggled to keep them dead, and Dinah brought them back to life. When all the dead were alive again, Grace would burst into tears and laughter because she was actually glad that Dinah could do this and really only wanted to be sure that Dinah had enough power to make it happen. And then Dinah would hug her, and if Richie was lucky, him too. Once, though, he smacked Grace when she was being particularly stubborn. He immediately started to run away for fear of Dinah's anger. I'll fix it, he remembered yelling as Grace cried, and Dinah moved toward him. do anything. What he meant was he'd do anything just so they didn't leave. No more hitting, said Dinah, hugging Grace. No more hitting aloud. Okay, okay, cried Richie. Say you're sorry, Richie. Okay, okay, I'm sorry, Grace. I'm totally sorry. I'll kill myself. Stop that, Richie, said Dinah. We don't talk like that. And he felt so much better. Grace rolled her eyes at him and snuggled against Dinah so he would know who Dinah loved best and who she took care of first. We need bandages for the hurt people, said Dinah. Do you think there are bandages? And then he goes into his father's dressing room and gets handkerchiefs to be the bandages. And I want to skip now over to chapter 4. Everybody's grown up. Dinah is married to a man named Raymond, who is a native West Virginian, who has had a lot of trouble in his life. He's done some pretty rotten things, some of which get detailed here. However, after being in prison for a while, he has become a kind of lay preacher. He wants to be a preacher. And much of this chapter following Raymond is partly about him writing sermons. He turns everything in his life into sermons, which is sort of the way I connected with him, because in other ways he's very much not like me. And again, listen for something from West Virginia history in the 1990s. The two greatest gifts Jesus gave Raymond Savage were, which is his name, Savage. Raymond Savage was what happened to him in prison, and Dinah. He got saved in prison, and Dinah was a woman in a million, loving and hardworking, and she lifted him up in everything. Sometimes her faith was not as clear as his, and she worried about 1,000 things that Jesus had assured Ray would be taken care of, but she was the mainstay of his life. He felt sorrow for her concerns and doubts, but didn't criticize. He trusted that one day she too would see more clearly, no longer through a glass darkly. She had accepted Raymond without asking the details. When he said, you know, I was in prison, but I haven't told you the whole story. She said, you did your time, Ray, and you came out a new man. That's enough for me. He prayed over that, and in the end, Jesus agreed with Dinah. She had the basic outline that he got mixed up with some bad actors back home in West Virginia. She didn't ask for more. Jesus told him to reveal the details on a need-to-know basis. Ray said, I need you to know I can have a foul temper, but I never took a man's life, and I never hit a woman. Dinah smiled, that smile of hers that was just one watt short of a revelation. Well, Raymond, I already knew you had a temper, and I already knew you were a good man. Dinah took him the way Jesus took him, failings and all. Dinah and Jesus were here for him, and he felt their love like a trampoline, letting him sink down and then sending him back up high. That's what Jesus could do for you. He ran the image through his mind, preparing a sermon. Or a good woman, if you can find yourself a good woman, or vice versa. Raymond was pretty sure Dinah assumed he'd gone to prison for assault and battery, and he had spent a couple of nights in jail after drinking and fighting, but he didn't regret his past. Jesus told him it was all material for reaching out to those hard-hearted men who hadn't learned yet. What got him into prison? Not some local lockup, but the federal penitentiary. Hadn't been alcohol and hadn't been anger, but stupidity. He had been in the dark, which means, he tried this out in his mind too, that you don't care enough about yourself to take care of yourself. It takes Jesus to learn to love yourself. The thing he hadn't told Dinah in detail was about the mountain militia plot to blow up the FBI fingerprinting center in Harrison County. It had been the 1990s, and Ray had been chronically short of money, and his friend Polk Riley had told him about it, driving trucks, hauling boxes. Polk also did time for stupidity. So when Polk showed up at the service station where Ray was working part-time all these years later with a business proposition, Ray knew it was time to tell Dinah the whole story. He was going to have to say, I need you to know how I know this man Polk Riley. He figured Dinah was going to say, skip the story and stay away from the man. But he and Polk went way back, long before the mountain militia. Back home in Cooper County, he and Polk had been in high school together, till Polk dropped out, and then later they used to hang out around Kingfield. Polk always had plans. Once he was going to make flies for fishermen and sell them mail order, and he had an idea to make high-quality moonshine and sell it to the college students who thought it was cool to buy illegal liquor. Old Poke was a special fan of the plots of caper movies and TV shows, and he liked to analyze what went wrong, what would have made it go right. He had a job as a night watchman, and he dealt pills and marijuana, and then he ran a gambling scheme using West Virginia University team point spreads. Raymond liked Poke, okay? Personally, in spite of all the nonsense, and even the mountain militia, he was fine when Poke showed up at the service station and started talking about the old days. He still had that big laugh, the big belly, and that ponytail, like a rockabilly guitarist, which he never was. They agreed they'd both been young and stupid for getting involved with the mountain militia. "I've got a real good job now," Poke said. "Salary and all expenses paid, and the proposition for you, Ray, is totally legitimate." He told him he worked for a rich businessman. The man had dabbled in growing marijuana at one time, Poke said, but now it was all legitimate investments. "I'm not going to lie to you, Poke. He's an oddball, but nothing illegal, and this man is looking to hire a preacher." Poke said he'd been visiting back home and heard Ray was a preacher now. "You know me, Ray, why put it in the paper when I know a man from home? It's about relationships, you know." The rich man, according to Poke, was thinking of starting a media center. He had a lot of ideas, but he wanted a religious program for his station or his podcast or whatever it was. Poke said, "So I thought of you, Ray. Come on down and get interviewed. It's a real opportunity." "Nothing illegal," Ray would tell Dinah, and could hear her saying, "And how do you know that, Ray?" Bobby Mack was working for the businessman too, Poke admitted. That made Ray a little uneasy. Ray wasn't prejudiced against small men, but Bobby Mack had a beaten-down, ratty look that always made him think of Judas Iscariot. The marijuana made him uneasy too. Poke said, "Look here, Ray, I only mentioned the weed to you so you wouldn't hear about it elsewhere. I want all the cards on the table. The businessman has been out of that a long time, and even when he was in it, he was diversified. He's always been diversified, and it's all going to be legal soon anyhow. My boss, he understands people have done things they maybe wish they hadn't in the past. He plans for the long haul, you see. He understands about being young and stupid. He likes people who made their mistakes and learned from them. That's why he took on me and Bobby Mack." Now, Ray certainly believed in second chances too. We all deserve a second chance. What is born again but a second chance? He prayed about it, of course, and Jesus didn't say much, but he didn't say no. Ray and Poke and Bobby Mack had been on the periphery of the mountain militia patriot thing. Ray had certainly never meant any harm to his country. That's one thing he was sure of. They never had much to do with the gung-ho ones. Ray went to a couple of meetings, but that was all. They said they were acting to stop the New World Order, and later on he found out that meant not only getting the government off people's backs, which he favored, of course, but also chasing out what they called the Jews and the jigs and the ragheads. Now that part made him uneasy to the point he decided he was going to collect his pay and get out, but he was too slow. "I was in darkness then," he said to himself, working on either the sermon or how he was going to explain this to Dinah. "That's what I was then. I needed money for my pleasures. I took from wherever. I don't think I would have put a gun to the back of a man's head and fired, but thank you, Jesus, I was never tested. I did take money from people whose lives were about hate, not love." He was looking to enjoy life, and he thought all he needed was a little money. And here came Poke, who knew someone who needed men to drive trucks, just carry a few things here and there. And they were paying $50 a pop, sometimes $100 for an hour or two's work. Raymond never doubted for a minute that they were hauling contraband because the pay was too good and got better as time went on. Also, the loading and driving was usually at night from garages to deserted barns or vice versa. Sometimes he was pretty sure they were stealing, but mostly they just seemed to be relocating materials that already belonged to the colonel of the Patriots, a man named Floyd Looker, a fellow in real estate and somewhat of a preacher too. The colonel wore fatigues and a beret, and Ray saw him maybe 3 times, but never had a conversation. Their meetings drew all kinds of people, sometimes big meetings, especially after certain things happened in the news, especially after the federal building in Oklahoma. Up until then, Ray had figured it was all about drugs, but he then realized that Floyd Looker and the others had more on their minds. Oklahoma City got them real enthused. They killed little children, he remembered thinking one night. What the hell is good about that? Ray had complained with the best of them about taxes and people taking away your rifle. All the savages, his whole family, were independent to their toenails, believing in taking care of their own, and death will take the hindmost. But when Bobby Mack started going on about how there was something to it, you had to be ready to fight the government, Ray had said, now, wait a minute here. My brother Duke was one of the very last to be killed over in Vietnam. I'm not interested in going against America. Polk said, hey, Bobby Mack supports our troop, don't you, Bobby Mack? And that's when Ray started thinking about getting out of it. But he was too slow. He never even knew if Bobby's last name was Mack or if that was part of his first name. That was how careless he had been in those days, straight into the devil's work for 50 or $100. It was 100 when it was explosives they were hauling. And that was when he was pretty sure they were stealing, although he was also pretty sure someone had paid off the guard at the quarry to be off in the woods pissing at 2 a.m. It was very precise. They had to drive in at exactly 2 a.m., break into a shed where they found about 500 pounds of blasting caps and old-fashioned dynamite. By that night, if not before, Ray knew that these so-called patriots were planning to blow up something, and he was sick of their meetings, and he decided that was it. He was finished. At the time, Ray hadn't yet met Jesus. He liked to say, I was wasting my substance and endangering my body and soul. And the next time there was a dead of night jump, he opted out, though he still did some of the daytime hauling for them. Then the whole thing broke loose. It turned out that Looker and the mountain militia patriots were going to blow up the new FBI fingerprinting facility before it even opened. Now, this fingerprinting center was a gift from West Virginia Senator Robert C. Byrd, who always took care of his own and got the facility moved from D.C. to West Virginia so people could have jobs or vote for him or whatever. Colonel Looker was convinced that the fingerprint center was the command center for the New World Order, the headquarters for sending out gangs of black men to rape white women, after, of course, taking away the white men's guns. So the idea was to blow it up before it opened. Most of what Ray knew he got from the newspaper and TV like everybody else. Old Colonel Looker had talked a fireman into giving him blueprints for the new facility, and he was collecting the explosives to do the job. Then the colonel made a deal with an Arab terrorist, and what was he doing in West Virginia anyhow? Didn't anyone have the sense to ask? And the Arab terrorist turned out to be a federal agent, and what's more, there had been agents following the whole thing all along. So Floyd Looker was at least as stupid as I am, Raymond thought. More stupid, because Floyd got 18 years. Some of the inner circle got 10, and the rest of them, the drivers like Ray and Polk and Bobby Mack, got 18 months or 2 years. He had read the whole thing in the paper and congratulated himself on being out of it. Never even realized he was about to get arrested till they picked him up back working at his brother's auto repair. Now that's the part that Dinah didn't know. What she did know was how in prison, that was the beginning of God's part in his story. In prison, Ray met the old man who aimed him straight at Jesus, up close and personal. Like the old man is a gun and I was a bullet, and he shot me into the heart of Jesus, and I have lodged there ever since. Ray used that whenever he had an opportunity to preach, which wasn't as often as he'd like. Another reason he wanted to check out the opportunity Polk Riley told him about, more preaching and less shit jobs. He wasn't quite sure how to present it to her, how to stop Dinah from saying, oh, that sounds real good, more bright ideas from the man who got you into prison. The fact was, Ray thought probably nothing was going to come of it. The idea of a rich businessman wanting to start a little digital broadcast church up on some mountain someplace, he decided he was going to pray on it for a while longer before he stirred up the whole mess by telling Dinah. He had always wanted his own ministry. In his imagination, he called it the Church of the Cross and the Lighthouse. He imagined a tower like a lighthouse with a huge neon cross fixed on it to save those poor, dumb-headed, drunk sailors, which is all of us. Thank you. I could feel you all listening, and I appreciate it. Listening is, to some degree, a lost art. So it's really important for those of you who have grandchildren that are still small. Read to them, hold them on your lap, and read to them. Because it's such a connection. I want to hear a little bit from you, respond to the story, ask me questions, ask me anything, and then at some point I'm going to go off and talk a little bit at some length, and then we'll come back to questions. Once we get started, I hope to move closer to you. But I need to warn you, I don't hear well, so you've got to use your outdoor voices. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, do you have a thread of religion in all of your 22 books?
Wait a second. Well, I think, go ahead.
Do you have a thread of religion included in all of your 22 books that you've written?
Do I include religion in it?
Yes.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. May I ask why you asked that? I'll certainly answer, but...
Because it seems like you have, you've stated a lot of religious things in your book, and I just wondered if that is a common thread for you in all of your books, that someone goes from a negative life to a more positive one with religion.
Thank you. That's a good and interesting question. I grew up in in Shinston, West Virginia, and the Baptist Church was the center of our social life. It was the First Baptist Church of Shinston, which is it's American Baptist, which of course is different from Southern Baptist or Northern Baptist. And it was just a part of my life. So I certainly can't write about West Virginia without including, and I'm going to say church more than religion. I mean, it's more about, to me, when I write about it, it's usually more about the being a center of social life, which is how I grew up. When I write about somebody like Ray, which was the long passage, I was interested in people like Ray who were very different from me. I mean, I actually was once in jail overnight for a political protest, but it's not the same as going to the penitentiary for a while. And I was fascinated by him because he is a person who has a lot of views that I personally don't share, but he has legitimate views. And part of the fun of writing for me is imagining that whole thing about walking in somebody else's shoes or moccasins or however that goes. And I love to imagine somebody else. So anyway, the way I could connect with him was he goes through life making up sermons. Whatever's happening in his present life, he's looking for a way to turn it into a message that he can give to these other people. And he's particularly focused on men, on lost men. I mean, he loves his daughters and he loves his wife and everything, but he's very interested in men who are lost. And that's his constant. The soundtrack to his life is creating something out of words. So anyway, that was a way for me to connect with him, which helped me go on to the next parts. Good, I'll manage to get about one question or two questions in if I go on that long. So, okay, and you really do have to shout out to me.
I certainly enjoy being read to, and I really enjoy being read to, and I did read to my sons growing up, and you are right, it is a special connection. And when you were talking about the characters and they were talking to each other, I kept thinking, I know somebody like that. I know somebody who was always scheming, doing things, trying to get ahead, trying to make. Are these characters, have you had experience with characters like this?
Yeah, I'm assuming people heard her. First she paid me a compliment, which was nice, and then she said she does read to children in her life, to her when they were growing up. How many of you, by the way, do read? Read to your children, read to other children, read to grandchildren? Quite a few of you. I'm not surprised because we are in a library. And then the next part of her question was, she said that the people that I wrote about, she seemed like she'd known people like that in her life, which I'm just delighted to hear because it means I touched something real for at least you. And then the question was, do I know those people? Have I met those people? And in most cases, there's almost always somebody who set me off towards a character. I don't seem to be capable of really writing memoir or the things that are about actual real people. I always change them. to me, one of the, and this is to my thing about what's fiction good for me, one of the things fiction is good for is that little jump of imagination. What if one of the guys I grew up and went to high school with, and there were some like Ray Savage who just really could care less about school and they dropped out and all that kind of thing. And what if I really knew him well? What would he be like when he's 40 or 50 or whatever age? So for me, yes, there's almost always a face I once saw, a person I knew, often peripherally. I rarely write about people that are terribly like people in my own life. I'm not sure that's true, but maybe. And I spend a lot of time imagining, like what. I mean, I could come away from today with somebody's face, and then, some months down the road, I think, gee, what would it have been like to be that gentleman or that lady, and then begin writing just in that way. That's how I work. Who else has a question they'd like to ask? I'm going to get my glasses, because it actually helps me hear.
Are there any current political or social situations that inspired you to write this particular book?
Any current political associations that set me off on writing this book? The book was really, I worked on this book for a long, long time. I started with the sisters, which I didn't even read about the sisters, because most of it is a story. They come from a very dysfunctional family. They've got this little friend, Richie. And Richie becomes, Ray is a kind of nice guy. I like Ray. Richie becomes a really unpleasant person in his adulthood. The part about, and I was doing some research, and I remembered the whole. How many people, by the way, remember the mountain militia in the 1990s down in Harrison County? Not that many of you, a few of you. And it's because Harrison County is where I was born, so that was a big deal to me. So I began reading about that, and that's where I got a lot of the ideas. And it turns out actually that Richie has a peripheral connection to some of those old anti-New World Order groups, and even farther back, the white nationalists like the National Front. Anybody ever heard of William Luther Pierce, the author of the Turner Diaries? Yeah, okay, Mark has. He's a guy who founded an extreme, a really radical right organization, and they bought property up in Pocahontas County in West Virginia, and I'm not sure what they're going to do there, but anyway, I have Richie buy some furniture and some and property from him as well. That's not a good answer. I know why it's not a good answer. It's because I write books over many years. Most of the work I do was begun maybe 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and I write a bit, I lay it aside, and then I get interested again, which means that it's almost never about contemporary events. So maybe that's the answer. But this is very personal. Other people, get stimulated by stuff happening right now, and that's what they write about. Good. I'm glad I talked long enough to be able to actually have an answer. That's one of the principles of public speaking. You keep talking until the right thing comes. Okay, who else has something they'd like to say or ask? I'm going to come back to you. But I want to say something. I have some notes on. It'll just take me a few minutes. I do want to say something about that issue of what fiction is good for. Now, it's obvious. It's so obvious. It's stupid that if you need to fix your lawnmower, you get a manual that helps you fix the lawnmower. That's very clear. What that is for. But there's a question of what fiction is for. And I would ask, let me ask it first, how many of you read fiction? A good many of you. Okay, I'm glad. Again, I'm not surprised because you're at lunch with books. Why do you read fiction? Now, again, I'm not asking why do you read history or biography, although those are questions also. Why do you pick up fiction? And be honest, maybe you never read anything except romance novels. And I'm curious what you read and why. So who could answer that for me?
I think it lets you use your imagination more than something that's
nonfiction, truthful.
Okay, so you like it because whatever it is that you're reading this book gets your imagination in action and does it. Okay.
It's
Who
an
else?
escape.
I'm sorry?
An escape.
And escape. These are totally true and totally genuine. Imagination, escape. I did that when I was moving about 2 years ago. It was a very difficult move. And I found, first of all, I found I couldn't read some of the things I usually read. And I started for the first time in my life reading police procedurals and mystery novels. And it was purely escape. You know, it was just because they always came up with an answer at the end. Awful things might happen along the way, but you knew that detective was going to get him in the end. And it was an escape from, moving boxes and stuff. So anyway, yeah. Who else?
I read fiction to really get to know a different culture or different people in the way they're thinking. And I find that in nonfiction, it's often very much just very factual, or your reading, your interpretation of those people is influenced and prejudiced by what you know of them.
Okay, all right. So you actually use it as a learning experience, and you feel in some way that it's a freer and maybe more honest or more truthful way of learning about others.
Right, because you're starting from the beginning. I mean, when you open a book, you know nothing about this person or this character. And so you have no prejudged view of them.
So you're not coming with whatever stereotypes you were raised with or whatever. Okay, that's an interesting point. Okay, who else has a thing?
I like murder mysteries, especially if someone gets murdered on the first page, first paragraph, first sentence.
Okay, you like it to happen. Why do you think? I just have to say, I've come to like it.
I like to find out and figure out and try to realize where the story is going and why did someone get killed, who was behind it, what procedure the police use in order to find the killer, find the background of the victim.
Okay, so you actually, it's a puzzle, a mental exercise along with, the other thing about fiction is it has to do more than one thing at once. If it's, or at least the best of it always does more than one thing at once. I think some of the best detective novels actually star the cities in which they take place. Some of them, they'll be like in Los Angeles, and you suddenly feel like you're getting Los Angeles along with the mystery of who did it and why and everything. So that's one of the things I would say is that the best fiction always does more than one thing. It both teaches you something and is some kind of escape or entertainment or whatever engages your imagination. I want to say for a writer, for me, I obviously can't speak for others, but for me, the reasons that I write are pretty closely related to the reasons that I read. I started writing very early as a little girl. I made comic books before I could actually really write sentences. And it was always, and that was certainly entertainment, self-entertainment. I was asked to be quiet sometimes, and I would do quiet things like that. And then I also wanted to share my experience and my version of things. And there was a point at which I started actually writing things that were a reaction to other writers, although I didn't realize that it was to books I read. I would read a book like Old Yeller. Remember Old Yeller? It was a children's book. It's a very sad ending, actually a horrifying ending. This wonderful pet dog, which I assumed was going to be saved in the end, gets rabies, protecting the narrator, I guess, or the main character, and the boy's father shoots him, with the shotgun thing. And I just remember thinking, how can that be? So I both loved this story and was horrified by it, and I went and wrote my own version of it. I called it, it's terribly creative, I called it The Yeller Dog. It was totally changing things, but I did change two things. One thing I changed was I made the main character into a girl. I wanted me to be in there, and I saved the dog at the end. It turned out to be an antidote for rabies. But what I was doing was I was engaging, with literature and talking back to writers, and that has continued to be one of the things that I do. And I hope I'm a little more, I have more to offer than just another version of someone else's story. But that's always part of it. I also, and I didn't realize what I was doing for a while. I also use my fiction as rhetoric. Rhetoric is a misused word. It used to be one of the things that the Greeks and Romans taught as a major subject for educated people. And the idea behind rhetoric is speaking well, mostly in their cases public speaking, and speaking in a way that you convince people of something important. So it is about convincing people, but it's a way of doing it that I think most fiction has in it. Now sometimes it's very obvious. Sometimes fiction is propaganda of a sort. A very famous novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which has taken a hit in recent years for being racist rather than what it wanted to be, which was totally abolitionist. But she did something very particular, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her husband was a minister, and she wanted to speak to white Christian women in the United States and convince them of the evil of slavery. And so she chose to do it by writing this novel. And it was highly successful. It was an extremely successful novel, sold very well. I think it's still worth reading, although maybe less she didn't really know much about slavery, but she did write really well about repressed women. And in fact, I always am struck by Abraham Lincoln was supposed to have said to her, such a wonderful man, but apparently he was also a sexist back in the day. He said to her, so you're the little lady who started this great big war. And he was complimenting her, of course, because it was one of it had a propaganda effect. And other kinds of propaganda would include things like the Turner Diaries that I mentioned, which is about race war in the United States and how to win it, basically. And so but even books that are completely not propaganda, books that are completely stories, are conveying a lifestyle, they're conveying a worldview, and I believe that, I'm not telling you what to read, but you should be aware of it. If you think about the detective novels and the thrillers, there's a tendency in them for the hero to be a kind of good guy outlaw. He never follows the rules. He always is a loner. The authorities are always stupid. They always make dumb mistakes. Sometimes they're venal. But he wins. Sometimes he often breaks the rules. And some of these people have done great things in the world. But the point is, I'm just pointing out that this is actually a worldview that's being given to us when we read those books. I actually believe that writing fiction for me, and the really best fiction, is an ethical project. And the ethical thing that I think I'm trying to do is what I already mentioned, which was the idea of imagining being in the shoes of other people in other times, of understanding the other in a way that you might not have otherwise. One of my favorite authors is George Eliot, the great 19th century novelist, whose 200th anniversary is coming up in November. And she wrote this once, and I don't know if I really believe it, but she wrote this. But man or woman who publishes writings inevitably assumes the office of teacher or influencer of the public mind. Let him protest as he will that he only seeks to amuse. He can no more escape influencing the moral taste, and with it the action of the intelligence, than a setter of fashions in furniture and dress can fill the shops with his designs and leave the decorating of people and houses unaffected by his work. So this is this actually is the thing that I take to be one of fiction's greatest projects, is helping us understand people who are unlike us, and along with that, a corollary is places and cultures and other things that are unlike us. And I don't want to make make it all too serious, and George Eliot was probably too serious. But even, but I do want to now ask you please to give me a little more response. Maybe you disagree, maybe you think I'm taking on something for fiction that it doesn't really deserve. But that, or anything you want to ask, I'd be happy. Ask me what it was like growing up in Shinston. I don't care. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'd like to know how you got from Shinston to Barnard.
To Barnard? do I hear it? Where are you? Are you from here? Okay. Would it seem strange for somebody from Wheeling to go to Barnard?
Yes. Occasionally.
Occasionally, yes.
Yeah.
It's a long story, but the short version is I was one of two people from my graduating class at Shinston High School who went out of state at all to college. Most of them went to the university, to Fairmont State College at that time. And one of them went out of state because his family moved to Florida, so he went for that reason. But I wanted to go out into the big world, and our minister put out a whole table full of college catalogs of places that had once been Baptist universities and colleges. Barnard wasn't one of them. So I went for 2 years to Bucknell University, and at that point in the late 1960s, dropping out of college to do something to change the world was really common. And I dropped out and became a VISTA volunteer, and they never would send you home. So they would never send somebody from Shinston, West Virginia to Appalachia, for example.
We got Jay Rockefeller.
Who'd you get?
Jay Rockefeller.
That was exactly, that precisely. Of course, I'm not sure who Jay's home people who were needy were, but yeah, you got Jay Rockefeller. They sent me to Norfolk, Virginia, which was a different world for me. And then after that year, I decided I wanted to go back to the city. I wanted to go to New York City. I applied to Barnard, and that's how it went. It was just, it was really kind of for me an opening up of possibilities. I think now, I'm not sure I would be so quick to leave. West Virginia, I have discovered in the years since I began publishing, has a really rich culture of writers and who are wonderfully supportive of each other. They have groups like the West Virginia Writers Association that I sometimes go to their conferences. And what is wonderful about them is they include both really highly accomplished people and people who are just beginning, all ages, all ethnic groups, all races. And it's just, there's something welcoming about the writing world in West Virginia, which when I was growing up, I thought you had to go to New York to be a writer. I really did. I didn't think you could get the experience here. So I go to New York and do most of my writing about West Virginia, so whatever that makes. Yes, sir.
I had a very interesting experience with fiction probably 40 years ago. First of all, I'm not a nervous flyer. I'm in Los Angeles, coming back to Cincinnati, 707. At the airport, I thought, what am I going to do? So I picked up the book at the airport.
Oh, no. Did you really say you picked up airport?
Needless to say, about a half an hour into the flight, I'm going to put the book down.
That's a kind of bad coincidence. Did you ever finish the book?
Oh, yes, I enjoyed the book. I've seen the movie several times. And I'm not a nervous flyer. About an hour into the flight, I had to put that book down.
Very interesting. No, there's no, we're so, at this point, we're so visual with all the stuff on television and the movies and everything, that we forget how moving a book can be. I mean, it really can, you decide you want to go to bed, and you can't go to sleep, and all these things, and it's a wonderful experience to read a book that moves you, and I'm glad that, are you still not a nervous flyer?
I never have been, but that book and that flight, that evening, more than I can handle. I'm actually an instructor. I teach people to fly. I couldn't finish the book.
Okay, there was a hand, yes.
Okay, Meredith, you mentioned the writers group. We have a Lehigh Valley Writers group as a club right in Wheeling. Our meeting is tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, right up the street of Cutie Pies. 7 o'clock tomorrow night. Anybody's welcome that wants to be a writer or just meet with other writers.
Which is, I'm really glad to hear that. I mean, one of the things about writing, as opposed to, say, theater or filmmaking or arts like that is that you do write alone most of the time. So it's really important to find other people that you can share their work with. I've been in a writer's group for, I think it's going on 40 years, because I know it started before my son was born. And we have had members die, we've had members, certainly they published a lot, and it's one of the most valuable sets of relationships in my life, because so I think that's great. Is this an open one that anybody?
Yes, it is.
And everybody reads, or what?
We read if we have something in progress, or even if we don't, we just make up short stories or poems. It's a varied group of people.
It's good. It's good. And I'm happy to hear from we need people who are just readers too. There are too many of us writers, I think, sometimes. But it's a great way to express yourself, to explore things. Who else had a comment or a question? So I saw another hand or two before.
I just wonder, what kind of novels do you read?
I'm sorry,
What kind of novels do you read when you have the time?
what do I read? Yeah. Well, and actually, what has happened as I got older was I began to teach. And the minute you teach writing, that means you're reading a tremendous amount of student work. So one thing is that I read a lot of that. And I read, it's new for me, but I've begun reading the cop mysteries, good ones. I don't have much tolerance for sloppy writing. I would read anything that's good writing, and that does not mean flowery. It doesn't mean fancy descriptions or long metaphors and similes, but good, clean action writing is a pleasure. So I'll read action. I read science fiction and fantasy sometimes, and I read a lot of 19th century novels. I've always been a fan of them. And here's something no one asked me about. I'm going to tell you anyway. No one asked me what do I read? Do I read big cover books or little paperbacks? And I've moved more and more to using an e-book reader. I use a Kindle. And I borrow books from the New York City Public Library, even though I live outside New York City. But they let you borrow books, and I don't know, does Wheeling let you borrow e-books? Yeah. So you save money, you save dead trees, although I never stopped me before. And I've discovered that anything, for me anyway, anything that's got a good narrative line, a good story, so that would be both 19th century novels and certainly thrillers or anything like that, goes really nicely in an e-reader. And again, you can change, if your eyes get tired, you can change the size of the font and all that. I say this mostly just so people know that I'm not totally old-fashioned in my tastes. You noticed I said that right after I admitted to loving 19th century novels. So, anyway, but however you read. I have a friend from Clarksburg named Phyllis Moore, who is, actually she grew up in Pennsylvania, in the part of Pennsylvania that's right between here and the other part of West Virginia. And she has been such a fan of reading books, and she has been trying to stop buying them. It's like she feels like she's being squashed by the books in her house, so she's begun to stop buying books. And she talks about how hard it is to put her name on the list in the library and have to wait for books. It kills her. Okay, does anybody have one last thing, because I want to make sure that we end on time. Anybody have a final question, comment? I would love it if any of you would, who like the internet, I have an e-list. I send out things about me, but I also send out a newsletter that I do every couple of months or so, where I just tell some books that I and other people have read. So I'd love it if you'd give me your email. I've got a couple of things up there about my books if you want them that are free. And of course I'm selling books, but that doesn't matter because it was. Anybody else? Any final question?
I have a comment that has absolutely nothing to do with so far what you've said, but my father-in-law roomed with Joe Stadahart.
With whom?
Joe Stadahart.
Oh.
A hero from Shinston.
That's right. No, I noticed. Yeah, my parents, I believe, were in high school with Joe Stadahart, or my dad taught him. I forget which it was. And here's. You know who Joe Stadahart is?
No.
He was a major league football
Football.
player from Shinster. But he failed typing class because his fingers were too big for the keys. He was apparently a really big guy. And where was that, at the university?
No, they played football together at the university, but then they were hungry, so they hitchhiked together up to Chicago to the World's Fair. Because they found out if they tried out for the football team there, they could eat for nothing.
We talk about the good old days. Okay, well, I'm going to, I see Sean is moving around over there like he's ready for this to end. And I really want to thank you all so much for coming. You're a great group. And again, I could hear you listening, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yodeling Dick here to tell you about a happening. Lunch with books. Lunch with books as books and hooks and hacks and cracks and yells and sings and rocks and slams with more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. It'll make you feel like yodeling. Hey, yodie, 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 yodie. Hey, yodie, yodie, take away the mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch. We'll provide the pop. And it's all free. Lunch with